Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. And today we're going to talk about women and weapons. Are you intrigued? I thank you for joining me today. And I'm getting kicked off right now. I've had a few people ask, well, am I going to interview anybody in these podcasts? I will, but it's the holiday times, and I need to ask a few folks that I would really enjoy speaking with you. And but so that'll come. But mostly, what I would like to do in the podcast is focus on particular Bible topics and Bible verses. Occasionally, we'll talk about theological issues, things about fundamentalism, apologetics, things like that, but mostly about Bible topics. So let's get started. So, the reason why I said women and weapons is that's really the theme of Ephesians. There's a great book out that came out last year by Professor Sandra Glahn, and she's from the Dallas Theological Seminary, and she's an expert in the cultural history and the times of the New Testament. And she wrote a terrific book named Nobody's Mother. It has a lot of personal experience in it because, being a woman in the field of biblical studies, she's a rarity, um, especially in a seminary like the Dallas Theological Seminary, which is a Baptist seminary, quite traditional, somewhat fundamentalist, you could say. So, for her to succeed in that seminary is actually kind of a testimony to her abilities. She grew up in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, and grew up in a household that had a strong mother, but also a traditional household. So she has some personal experience to bring to this as well. One of the main things about Ephesians and also First Timothy, is that most biblical scholars in the last few decades have really questioned whether these are Pauline. And there's a lot of reasons to think that they're not Pauline or like genuine letters of Paul. Uh, but what Professor Glahn does is says, we shouldn't be so quick to judge, honestly, because Ephesians in particular has the gloss, or or I should say, the reason why it's considered not Pauline is because of its language. But she says it has the gloss of military language, and that given Paul's cleverness that you see in other letters and his cultural sophistication, which he clearly had, also given the timing, the topics, where he was at that time, uh, she thinks that Ephesians very well could have been Pauline, and maybe a little bit against sort of the more historical criticism orientation by using textual criticism. She says this. And her primary reason for that is especially around the idea of how women are portrayed in Ephesians. Now, Ephesians and especially First Timothy. Now, the First Timothy and Second Timothy are quite different, so we don't know if they're by the same author or not. First Timothy is a little bit more problematic about being Pauline. It's part of the pastoral letters: First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus. But First Timothy is a credible, is at least credibly Pauline. And but the reason why these are important to kind of lump them together is because, first of all, they're all about Ephesus and where they take place. The pastoral letters and Ephesians, of course. But secondly, because the way they're used by us, um, these are especially First Timothy chapter 2 and Ephesians chapter 5 are used for misogyny by modern Christians. And I shouldn't say just modern Christians, but they've been used that way for centuries. So we've gotten an impression that Paul is a misogynist. I've had people in my um, congregation and other Christians that I've spoken to, especially women, who say things to me like, Pastor, I'm a true believer. I love Christianity and everything, but that Paul guy, I just kind of hate him. And why is that? Well, I get why. And it has less to do with who Paul is and what he says than how he's used. So, particularly when you look in Acts and you look in Romans, to a lesser extent, but also in parts of uh, First and Second Corinthians, you can see that Paul actually treats women with a lot of respect because he mentions 18 different women, or 18 different women are mentioned in his um, either about him in Acts or by him in letters. And some are very prominent, like Priscilla, Lydia. We only hear about Eunia once, but she is basically equated to being an apostle, and Phoebe, is the other one as well. So clearly, if Paul were a misogynist, he wouldn't have elevated women so much in his writings. Number one. Number two is there's a lot of research that's been going on about about the time, and that early Christianity had a lot of women in it because early Christianity was a way for women to be freed from the bonds of this highly patriarchal Roman society, particularly widows. So there's some indication that, for example, Phoebe, who traveled to Rome, she probably wouldn't have traveled to Rome um, if she were married, because she would be under the purview of a man. She probably was wealthy because she's described as a benefactor. She wouldn't have been wealthy by if she were married. So likely, a lot of scholars believe that Phoebe was probably a widow and probably head of household by default and didn't get remarried. As soon as he got remarried, of course, he would lose your inheritance. The inheritance would go to the husband. So in her case, you think about her, she probably pretty well educated, may have been upper class woman, um, may have spoken Latin. A lot of people in Greece at the time, if they were associated with the law in any way or with the leadership and politics, many of these people actually had some knowledge of Latin because that's how you communicated with the Roman Empire. So there's a lot of belief that maybe that's why she was chosen to deliver the letter to the Romans, because if she spoke Latin and she was upper class and independent and independently wealthy, that would be the kind of person you would do that with. So she's just one example. And there's a bit of speculation around her because she's not mentioned many times. Priscilla, on the other hand, is mentioned quite a bit. So we get a little bit bigger picture of her. So anyway, this is the idea of who's Paul? I mean, Paul obviously clearly works with, relies on, and is supported by women. So to say that Paul is a misogynist is just not right. Now, you can't say, and I will never say, Paul is a feminist. No way. You couldn't be, and in that society, you really couldn't be a feminist in the way that we think of feminism. But it's probably that Paul was more neutral, essentially. We know that Paul did anything he could. You could see throughout Acts, he was very flexible and he did everything he could to preach Christ crucified. And we know this is that that's why he traveled at least 3 times, maybe 4 times, because he was out doing the gospel to all these different cultures, different languages, different kinds of people. So he would use any means he could to spread the gospel. And if that meant rich widows helping him out and rich widows traveling on his behalf and preaching on his behalf, you betcha Paul would do it. I'm quite certain of that. So to say Paul was a misogynist is, I think, just not doesn't hold up to the facts. So why do we think that Paul's a misogynist? Well, this is why. First of all, misuse of the words in Ephesians. Paul uses two different words that are associated with submission. And those words are hupotasso in Greek, which means to submit, and hupakuo, which also means to submit. So you go, well, why are they different? They're actually quite a bit different. Hupotasso is a military word, and it means basically a soldier to submit, giving his fealty to a commander. Hupotasso is used that way throughout. Hupakuo means a slave, meaning total submission. Children are described as having hupakuo type submission, whereas women and wives are hupotasso. So they're partners. And when you think about the fealty that a soldier gives to a commander, even in that society, even in Roman society, with hierarchy, it was still commanders, all good commanders know that they need the loyalty of their soldiers in order to be successful. Of course, not all commanders are good commanders, but all good commanders know that really well. You can't force people to fight for you unless they have some loyalty. You can try, but it doesn't work. Whereas hupakuo is involuntary submission. So huputasso, voluntary submission. Hupakuo, involuntary submission. Hupatasso means loyalty. You have to have loyalty to be submissive in the hupatasso way. Hupakuo doesn't require loyalty because you have absolute control over the person. So slaves and children are hupakuo. Women and soldiers are hupatasso. This is really important because given the culture, the highly patriarchal culture that Paul was in and talking to people in, when you go to Ephesians chapter 5 and it talks about the submission of wives to their husbands, this is the kind of offering in partnership. So 521 is basically more a mutual thing. 522 is where it looks like maybe less mutual. The idea is that the honor of the man or the protection of the man was just considered normal. That the wife, in giving fealty to the husband, meant that she would protect his honor. So her business was about protecting his honor. His business was about protecting her, physically, providing for her and things like that. So while we may consider that unequal in our society, in that society, for Paul to use the word hupatasso for wives to their husbands is actually a lot more mutual than the greater society around them. And probably taken into our context, we would consider it virtual equality. And that's what we do. I think for the right things, is we tend to think that marriages are mutual and have equality of the sexes. At least most of us do. Of course, some don't, but most of us do. We certainly expect marriages to have mutual consent. It's illegal to be married without mutual consent in all 50 states, for example, and most Western societies. You can't force people to get married anymore. You used to be able to, but you can't. And same things, we believe in marital rape, for example, that there is such a thing, and that you can't force a wife to have sexual relations without her consent. that's illegal. So now, of course, in Roman society, those things didn't apply, but you can see the progress from that kind of a marriage in Roman society, which was definitely, in the Christian context, better than society as a whole, and that what we would consider today a good marriage in our context, better than maybe other societies, or at least the rest of society. We want the equality of women, and we want the consent of women. So that's how you can relate that, right? The next part of it is when you go to Ephesians chapter 6, there's lots of military language. There's lots of talk about, having the sword of righteousness and, or the shield of righteousness and so forth. And you go, well, wait a minute. What's all this about? Why would Paul use military fealty in chapter 5 and talk about defense in terms of and having shields and swords in chapter 6? Now, of course, again, these are kind of used improperly, in my opinion. Usually chapter 6 is used to say, to be defense of the faith, that I'm going to have my Bible as the sword, and I'm going to go out and fight the evil forces, the hidden evil forces, and do spiritual warfare. It's not exactly what it means, and it's not what Paul meant in that case. He's talking about, you notice it talks about principalities against principalities. Now, this is code in Paul, and this is where Sandra Glahn talks about sort of the military language that Paul uses is a little bit of code in order to get through to the Ephesian people. Ephesus had the cult of Artemis, the goddess of warfare, the goddess, a very independent goddess, was in Ephesus, was highly revered. And she was also the goddess of childbirth and comfort in childbirth. So in Ephesus, by the standards of Roman society, especially compared to a Jewish man like Paul, probably seemed pretty darn feminist, those Ephesians, and, maybe those women were a little out of control by being too much. I'll talk about that in a minute, but by talking in military terms and using the language that was familiar to the Ephesians, in that way, Paul could communicate to them without getting in trouble. If you look in Acts, for example, the cult of Artemis. Remember, there's a story about Paul basically being attacked in Ephesus for disrupting the business of the silversmiths in Ephesus. He was kind of upsetting the apple cart. If he spoke too openly by saying, Artemis is, don't worship Artemis, you need to worship Jesus instead. In other words, discounting Artemis, which was a very positive figure in Ephesian society, well, he would have just been run out on a rail, which he kind of almost was, maybe kind of was. So he had to be careful with his language. And this is what Sandra Glahn says. It's just that by Paul adopting Ephesian language, which is also the reason why people think that Ephesians is not Pauline, he was able to communicate to the people and keep himself out of jail at the same time. So he compares Jesus to Artemis. He compares the protection of Jesus. He compares the submission of the church to Jesus in the same terms as the fealty of soldier to commander, or the fealty of wife to husband. So you can see how he's very cleverly using this language to communicate to a people that probably wouldn't have heard him, or probably would have rejected him if he didn't speak in this way. So that leads us to the other scripture, and that is 1 Timothy chapter 2. And this is also where Dr. Glahn's book really talks a lot. And this is where the title comes from, Nobody's Mother. Because in 1 Timothy chapter 2:15, it talks about about women being freed by childbirth or being saved by childbirth. And that's completely misused by the church, especially the Catholic Church, used that in order to say that the purpose of a woman was to give birth, and that because a woman, when she's faithful, a faithful mother, she will then be fulfilling her purpose and be a good woman. Very misogynistic message when taken. So childbirth is great, of course. Protection in childbirth is paramount, but the idea that the only purpose for a woman is to bear children is, is not really the sense of what that is. But it was used but that way. Now, of course, maybe misogynistic or very patriarchal people in ancient times thought that way too. I mean, certainly the Jews felt that way about women and childbirth in the Old Testament times. Absolutely. But the idea is that that's what that means, because that's also Artemis language. Artemis was the goddess of protection in childbirth. And that's what that verse, 1 Timothy 2:15, really means. It means you as a woman don't have to fear, because you'll be protected in childbirth just like Artemis protects you. You will be protected just like Artemis protects you. This is an allusion to Jesus being protector. That you can trust Jesus. You can take this positive image and positive figure of Artemis, and you can say, Jesus is like that too. And we see how Paul does that. I mean, he did it on the Areopagus in Athens. He basically says, hey, you have an unnamed God. You don't know who he is, but I do. I know who he is. That's the God I'm talking about. That's the God of Jesus. He's doing the same thing to the Ephesians. You've got Artemis, and I get it. Artemis is a very positive, supportive figure for you. But I've got Jesus, and Jesus is more than that. So you can trust Jesus. That's what that verse is really about. Now I'm going to get to the worst verse of all, and that's verse 9 and 10. 1 Timothy 9, 1 Timothy 2, 9 and 10. This is the one about where women are to keep silent and not have authority over men. Authority in teaching. And I'm not going to go real deep into this. There's lots of scholarship about this, but the idea is that probably Paul, if Paul wrote it, is talking about a single woman. It's definitely a singular noun. It's a single woman. Probably talking about a case of domineering, or a woman domineering. It could be also that he's also using Artemis language and saying, Artemis you shouldn't trust. You can't put all your trust in Artemis because she's dominating. Less likely that. More likely, I do not permit a woman to have authority in the church is probably about a particular case. Now, also remember, there's two different genres here. Ephesians is written to the church, to a church. It is meant as a public letter for everyone to see. So Paul has to be really careful in Ephesians, because he knows his name's going to be attached to it. The church's name's going to be attached to it. So if he says something that's really too offensive to the authorities, it's going to cause a lot of trouble. Timothy, he can be a lot more open, because, at least as far as we know, Timothy is a letter written to an individual, to Timothy, giving him authority And there's many verses in 1st and 2nd Timothy talking about giving Timothy the tools, the equipping him and giving him the authority to be a minister, to minister to the people. Paul's authority, but also the authority of Scripture, as we read in 2 Timothy 3:16, for example. That's all about giving Timothy the authority of the Hebrew Scriptures and using that. So that's why we see the difference in language. But again, it's to the Ephesians. It's for the Ephesians in this case. And that's why, again, you really can't look at these verses to use against women and against women in leadership, because Paul had women in leadership. He used women in leadership. He talks about Phoebe is a deaconess, a deacon, okay, a leader. Eunia, because of a sleight of hand in the Greek, people will say, oh, well, she was just liked, the apostles thought great things about Eunia, or they even turned Eunia into a man by calling her Eunias, which is ridiculous. It's not, at all. The fact is that I think almost an honest reading and exegesis of the Greek is Eunia was an apostle, and she was considered an apostle. Priscilla was considered a pastor. Her name is first. She talks like a pastor. She teaches. She's a teacher. She's a leader. So Paul is clearly working with using the authority, giving authority to women and supporting them. And even in the most, what we consider misogynistic, especially 1 Timothy chapter 2, but also 1 Timothy chapter 3 is used for this when he talks about the qualifications for leadership. And none of that in there precludes women from being leaders. People use it because they're masculine nouns. He uses a bunch of masculine nouns in chapter 3, but that's like you and me in English saying, well, all of mankind. Well, when you say mankind, we all know that means humankind. We don't use that terminology so much anymore, but we know, or that man does this or man does that. Up until, I would say, maybe 30 years ago or so, that was the common language that we would use masculine nouns to describe people of both genders. And that's what happens in Greek. Greek is filled with that. The word adelphoi means brethren, but brethren meaning men and women, right? An adelphos is a man. An adelphe is a woman, but an adelphoi is men and women. Adelphoi, the plural. So this is how these are misused. They're kind of cherry-picked, these couple of verses. There's a bad one in 1 Corinthians 14, 30, I think 36 through 38. I can't remember exactly, but you can find it there. Very misogynistic. Clearly not written by Paul. There's all kinds of scholarship about that. Probably was a marginal note written a couple centuries after Paul, or a century or two after Paul, and then somehow got into the text. There's a lot of examples of that. If you look at Dan McClellan's stuff, he's a public biblical scholarship guy. He talks quite a bit about this. But except for these couple of verses, you have no basis for excluding women from leadership and ministry. It just, you have to work really hard, and you have to basically rely on the misogyny of the Catholic Church to exclude women from leadership and ministry. So this is why women and weapons go together, because talking in these military terms was how Paul communicated to the Ephesians, not only Ephesians, but mostly to the Ephesians, a militaristic society. Remember, Rome was a very militaristic society. Rome is like America, right? We're a militaristic society. We love the military. We celebrate them, don't we? And we rely heavily on them because we're the dominant military force in the entire world. Just like Rome. Rome is exactly the same way. They spent, uh, many more times what their budget to have a strong military, and they had the strongest military in the world for centuries, 400 or 500 years. So that's why it fits. That's why Paul uses these military words, if in fact Paul wrote these letters. Like I said, we don't know for sure. We never can, but that's what Sandra Glahn's hypothesis is. That's why we think that it wasn't written by Paul, was because of the way he used language to this group of people. So with that, I think that this is a good example of how we need to understand the societies that these are written to. I often say, I had a professor that said this, whenever you read scripture, you always have to ask 3 questions to do good exegesis of scripture. And that is, who wrote it? Not necessarily the individual, because we don't always know if something was written by the author that it was said, or whether it was what's called pseudo-epigraphic, which means written by another author in that person's name. Or in the case of, say, the book of Hebrews. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. We have a lot of speculation about who it could have been, but it's not signed, essentially. But it's not who the individual who wrote it, but where do they come from? What is their point of view? A Pauline letter comes from a Jewish man who was a Pharisee, who converted to Christianity and was an evangelist to the world. Okay, that's who he was. Number 2 is, who is it written to? So is it written to Ephesians? Is it written to the upper classes, the lower classes? Is it written to Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians? Was it written to who? This church or that church? And what their context was. And then the third thing is, what's the purpose? Why was the book written? Why were the Gospels written? Well, the Gospels were written to churches that needed to hear messages of encouragement after Jesus had been gone for, the crucifixion happened 30, 40 years earlier. First-hand accounts were fading. The apostles were dying or dead already. We needed to write things down for the churches. And that's why the Gospels were written. And they were written a little bit different depending on which church they were being written for. And that gives the purpose, is then, is it to spread the gospel? Is it to remind people? Is it to encourage people? So, for example, the book of Revelation, that wasn't written about future prophecy nearly as much as an oppressed people who were being really pressed hard by the Romans in the late 1st century in Western Asia Minor. These people needed encouragement. They needed somebody to fight for them. That's essentially what it is. It's a revenge story about, these people are treating me so bad, I need God on my side. We'll talk a lot more about Revelation in upcoming episodes. But so that's that background. Remember those 3 things. Who wrote it? Who was it written to? And what's the purpose of the writing? That's what you need to do good exegesis of any scripture. And that's what I believe that Dr. Glahn has done with Ephesians and 1 Timothy in her book. Her book again is Nobody's Mother by Sandra Glahn. Hi, thank you for listening to me today. And as I always say, people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there. And God bless you.